I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Rosie.
I'm Jake.
And today we're talking about the Flintstones, which, as I think I said when I was choosing it last time, isn't a great favourite with either of us, but it's something that we've watched, and it's very, very interesting. It's got a few factoids to boast. Like Night of the Living Dead, it can claim to be a genre starter. It was the first ever prime-time animated family sitcom, family audience, and family genre. I'm sure we can think of a few of those that followed. It was the first TV show to have a theme song about itself. And Fred and Wilma Flintstone were the first TV couple ever to be shown in bed together. I don't think they were ever naked or anything like that. They were just going to bed, going to sleep. And we'll tell you a bit about what the Flintstones is, even though I think probably everybody knows. It was a cartoon made by Hanna-Barbera, and there were loads of those, weren't there? And I think you could argue that the most famous is either the Flintstones or Scooby-Doo. And I was thinking, perhaps I won't say it's definitely the Flintstones, because you could argue that Scooby-Doo is the most enduring. It's the one that they keep on making to this day. But certainly the Flintstones is the one that we can think of things to say about it. The original series ran from 1960 to 1966, so as you can imagine, seeing a married couple in bed for the prudes of the 60s must have been quite a shock. And then after that they made a lot of specials and other series and things like that. They made a Fred, Barney, Wilma and Betty as kids show, a bit like they made a pup called Scooby-Doo.
It was interesting to spot while looking through the follow-ons from the Flintstones. It was pretty much producing some sort of new material from the end of the original series in 1966 through to the early to mid-90s. An early one being the Pebbles and Bam Bam show, featuring Pebbles and Bam Bam as teenagers. But as you say, you had then going back to the adults as kids and various other cartoons involving the Flintstones, and the Flintstones mixed in with other Hanna-Barbera stuff, the Flintstone Comedy Hour, culminating in specials in the 90s, ending up with Pebbles and Bam Bam getting married and having their twins. That's where that particular continuity eventually ends. So over 30 years worth of new material there, going through several voice actors for everybody except Wilma, who always manages to be the same woman.
So now we've mentioned Fred, Wilma, Barney, Betty, Pebbles and Bam Bam in the assumption that everybody knows who they are, and I think that they do. Of course, they're the families in this family sitcom, and only half of them are the Flintstones. But they really are a sextet, aren't they?
They very much are. When I was watching that clip of Pebbles and Bam Bam's wedding and everyone was crying and it was all going to be different, I was saying, I don't know what they're making a fuss about. They've always all been basically one family unit anyway, and they still are, just legally as well as practically now.
Another thing that I think everybody knows about is the USP of the show, and it's very clear, distinct, isn't it? There's nothing else like it. I suppose there are aspects of it in other things, but they are the modern Stone Age family, or families. Modern and Stone Age are the key words anyway, and when I was little, I didn't know about prehistory and I didn't know about cavemen, and I started to learn about these things by asking Mummy to explain what the hell the Flintstones were all about. Jake says that we used to eat our supper and watch it in the evening, sort of 6 o'clock was supper time, wasn't it? I don't remember that at all. Or perhaps I do remember it a bit, because I know that I watched it when I was very, very young. So our mum explained to me that millions of years ago people lived in caves and made things out of stone, and that was the Stone Age, and they dressed in animal skins. That was what the Flintstones and their contemporaries were wearing. And I thought, oh, okay then. Fred clearly has an animal print tunic on, and then I thought, well, okay, Barney's got a brown garment on, that's fine. I guess you can get white animals for Wilma's, but where the hell did Betty get a blue dress? So that was a bit of a gripe I had as a child. And I said, oh, and were the dinosaurs in this Stone Age then? And our mum said, no, there were never dinosaurs and humans at the same time. I guess I knew there had been dinosaurs. And I was terribly disappointed, and I thought, well, why would they make a cartoon that's historically inaccurate, which sounds a ridiculous thing to say about the Flintstones now, but I was very little. I thought, why would they make a cartoon where there were dinosaurs and people at the same time if there weren't any? But of course the Flintstones is anachronistic in both directions, and this is another big part of the USP. They've got things such as houses, furniture, telephones, television, cars, either made out of stone, including the television. They don't explain how the screens actually receive any signal, but it doesn't matter. Or they're some sort of prehistoric creature. It's not just dinosaurs, of course. They have a saber-toothed cat for a pet. Things like a mammoth for a shower, and a sort of prehistoric aardvark thing with a protruding nasal implement for a vacuum cleaner. Their telephone is made out of stone, and the mouthpiece is some sort of horn from a creature. They've got cars, but they have to kind of walk their cars. We drive with them down the street through the courtesy of Fred's 2 feet, because they're like those red and yellow cars that children always had when we were young. As I've commented before to Jake, the one thing they don't have that people had in the 60s in any way, shape or form is shoes.
It's a very vague and hazy time in my early life when we used to watch the Flintstones with Safa, but I do remember very clearly that it did happen. I got the idea of the mix of time periods, dinosaurs, cavemen, modern stuff, helped a lot by the words of the theme tune. And it was certainly later episodes that they were showing at about 6 o'clock for the family audience, and a very wise decision that was. They had Pebbles and Bam Bam, and the whole sequence in the opening and closing credits that helped so much to explain the show and really helped me get the idea of it. I think having had that sort of initial exposure to it, it can be quite surprising to hear that there are 2 full seasons of Flintstones at the beginning without any sign of Pebbles or Bam Bam, without the Flintstones Meet the Flintstones theme tune, a different instrumental theme tune. And an interesting thing we did notice at one point about those early ones is, how do the cars work? They sit in the cars with their feet up and the cars just move. And that was a logistic they thought of later. Actually, they're moving the cars with their feet. But when you watch that instrumental opening, which has the sequence of Fred driving through bedrock and encountering various modern Stone Age activities, you see that's the original USP of the show. Here's a caveman, and oh look, here's a modern Stone Age world he's in. There's a Brontosaurus fire truck and things like that. And that's why you're going to enjoy the show. But of course, looking back on it in the way we do, that's not nearly enough. Yeah, we know it's a modern Stone Age show. Where's Pebbles? Where's Bam Bam? Where's the theme tune? It's not proper. So I think the first 2 seasons of the Flintstones, yes, very much do feel their way in and expand the premise well, and that's the bit that we remember and people remember when it's really found its feet and fleshed itself out as the modern Stone Age family.
I must admit I'd forgotten that about the cars, even though we watched all the theme tune sequences the other day. But I do remember now that you say it. I think we noticed it when I found that Boomerang was showing the Flintstones. It used to show all kinds of Hanna-Barbera cartoons. Hong Kong Phooey, Inch High Private Eye, Captain Caveman. How memorable are they? Not as memorable as the Flintstones. And I watched some of them, and I thought, oh, the Flintstones, that ought to be interesting. And I was actually knocked for 6 when I noticed that they hadn't got any children. I sort of assumed they'd always been there. It was partly because I didn't ever remember seeing them without, and it was also because why would you make a family cartoon, again, the family audience and the family genre, with no children in it? That's going to be boring, and it was boring. and I can't remember what made me decide to stick with it or give up on it or how long it went on for, but I do remember there were about 3 episodes where Fred mistakenly thought that Wilma was pregnant. Perhaps there were a few episodes apart, but they were showing like 2 in the hour slot every day, so it seemed to happen awfully close together. He would see her knitting or overhear her talking about looking after somebody's dog or something, I don't know, and leap to the conclusion that she was pregnant. And I kept thinking, oh, I hope she is. I'm going to stick with this if Pebbles comes along and Bam Bam can't be far behind. And she never was, and I did actually give up on it at some stage. But then Pebbles doesn't come along, does she, until quite late in season 3. We found out that in that season Wilma announces her pregnancy in episode 19. Pebbles is born in episode 23, and I watched on Daily Motion the clip of Wilma announcing her pregnancy, and she is knitting, and it's supposed to be a sock, and Fred saying, oh, I've been needing a nose warmer, and I thought to myself, perhaps the writers haven't quite remembered how big Fred's nose is. It's nearly as big as an adult foot. But anyway, what I did notice was that they were in twin beds. And I think I turned round to you and said, hey, hang on a minute, they're supposed to share a bed. And I went Googling, investigating this. Was that a myth? Didn't they really share a bed? And in some episodes they did, and in some episodes they didn't. And I did find a clip of them in the same bed shortly before Pebbles is born, when Fred's getting all agitated about when the moment comes. And I thought to myself, maybe they didn't want them in the same bed when she's actually announcing her pregnancy. Maybe that would have been a bit too much for the censors.
As you said to me recently, adding kids to a show, and it's particularly true in the case of the Flintstones, does give it a lot of extra life, a whole extra dimension, liven it up a bit. And it's true if you think of something like The Simpsons, where would that be without the kids? At the moment we're watching the 1960s TV series Addams Family. When Wednesday and Pugsley appear in it, they certainly liven up the show in their own way and give it an extra dimension. Pebbles and Bam Bam do that to such an extent in the Flintstones that, as has been mentioned, it's actually rather boring without them. I was finding out all about the episodes in which they come in and in which the theme tune with the lyrics comes in. The first version of the Flintstones theme tune has Fred and Wilma and the 2 pets going to the drive-through movie. And I think, well, that's quite a limited family, isn't it, in terms of what should be a TV family? A husband and wife and their dog and cat. Of course, they're a dinosaur, Dino, and a Smilodon, their saber-tooth cat. But when they get Pebbles as well, that's much more of a family. And they have a whole season of that being the opening of Modern Stone Age Family being Fred and Wilma and their 2 pets. And then I discovered that Pebbles, having been born late in season 3, gets added to that opening at the beginning of season 4. Bam Bam first appears in season 4, episode 3, and he's adopted by Barney and Betty. And Rosie knows all about that episode. And then eventually in episode 6 of season 4, Bam Bam 2 makes it into the credits. And indeed, Barney and Betty haven't been in the opening sequence until Bam Bam's there with them. And so the sequence is there as we know it, as we think it should be.
I want to talk about Pebbles some more, and Bam Bam, I suppose, because they were always there together when I was a child, and I think I must have been a very perceptive child spotting that about Betty's dress. I didn't think it about Fred's cravat, particularly, by the way. He does have a blue cravat. But I also thought, as quite a little girl, how interesting and how progressive that the girl, out of this girl and boy, belongs to the main family, the Flintstones. Normally you would expect them to have the boy, because if a baby is born into something, it's generally a boy, isn't it? Or if there is more than one child, the boy's older, perhaps works a few more hours, like Pugsley and Wednesday Addams, or the boy is younger, but he's like the main one, and he's got this stereotypically teenage girl sister, like Elroy and Judy Jetson, or, again, it's about the boy, and there's a annoying older sister or younger sister from his perspective, like Fantastic Max and Zoe. It's always boys, boys, boys on these things, I thought. I'm glad that Pebbles belongs to the Flintstones and Bam Bam belongs to the Rubbles, because it's just a bit unexpected, it's a bit different, it's giving girls a chance. And then when I was an adult, so this must have been some decades later, I was reading about the Flintstones, and I read that it had kind of been taken as read that this baby they were going to create for the Flintstones would be a boy. They were planning a boy, and then somebody said, hey, wait a minute, if it were a girl, we could cash in with the merch because we could market a doll, and little girls would buy the little girl doll. And I thought, oh, well, that's a bit disappointing that that's the reason. But I'm still quite glad about it anyway, because I don't think anyone really remembers the Pebbles doll, but they certainly remember her part in the show. And to go on and talk about Bam Bam and his introduction, I will just have to mention the 1994 movie, because I hadn't realised until we went to see that in the cinema that Bam Bam was adopted. I assumed he was Barney and Betty's biological son, or I assumed that he had been introduced in the same way as Pebbles. I didn't realise that they'd gone into pregnancy and taking her to the hospital to be delivered and stuff, but they don't pull any punches with that on the Flintstones, apart from not explicitly saying these couples have sex, but they certainly don't say that that didn't happen. There's no mucking about with the stork or the cabbage patch or anything. And I don't remember seeing the introduction of either Pebbles or Bam Bam in the cartoon, so I didn't know, and it's a big thing at the beginning of this film, near the beginning. I thought, no, he's adopted, is he? And I think I probably got our mum to confirm this after the film was over. And then again, a number of years later, I was interested in finding out how that came about, and I was reading that the Flintstones dealt with issues of all sorts of things that gave it claim to be mature and innovative, and one of them was infertility. And I thought, well, I don't suppose Barney and Betty go and get a Stone Age fertility test and all that kind of thing, do they? So I found out which episode was Bam Bam's introduction, and it was available on Daily Motion. Very useful for episodes of the Flintstones. The episode starts with Fred and Wilma kind of having a bit of an argument, which they often did, because Fred was being a bit possessive of Pebbles and saying that Barney and Betty were coming to see her too much, and Wilma's saying, how can you say such things, Fred, when they haven't been blessed, I think were her words, with a child like we have. So that's not to say the stork didn't bring Pebbles, if that's what you want to tell your children, but also it's not to say that they didn't get her the usual way, conceive her naturally. And it's implied, though not explicitly said, that the Rubbles have found out that they can't, or they've been trying and come to the conclusion that they can't. And in my assumption that they don't go and get tested and go through all the proper channels, it turned out I was right. Betty and Barney have this conversation that leads to Barney wishing on a star for a baby, and then, by coincidence, Bam Bam is left on their doorstep. They find him in the morning, and Barney's all like, hey, my wish came true, and Betty is saying, oh, don't be silly, Barney, this isn't our baby, and Barney's like, yeah, it is, I wished for him. And I thought, is Barney being too infantilized here? He must know where babies come from. He and Betty must have sex, or they couldn't reasonably have expected to have a baby before Bam Bam turned up. So I thought maybe that wasn't so very well done. And Wilma's saying to Betty, you can't really just keep him, Betty. And Betty says, oh, I know, we're going to officially adopt him. And then they have some issues with that. This other family wants to adopt a baby, and they're richer than the Rubbles. And I can see what people mean about the emotional depth. Betty is getting very distraught, and Wilma's saying, maybe you can adopt another baby. And she's saying, I don't want another baby, I want Bam Bam. And obviously in the end they get Bam Bam. And I did think maybe they didn't set out to explore these issues and themes. I kind of suspect that they thought, well, we need to give the Rubbles a baby too now. And they sort of wanted a quick baby, and they wanted it to be different from when Pebbles came along, and they came up with the storyline that way. But it's a very interesting episode anyway, and livened up by the presence of both Bam Bam and Pebbles, which just goes to show how they inject some life into the show.
And clearly, Pebbles and Bam Bam together always did light up the screen as a couple, even as infants. You were saying to me the other day, perhaps it's the youngest toy ship ever, but the creators obviously saw a lot of potential in it because the Pebbles and Bam Bam show jumps to them as teenagers, as a couple, and this used to be on when we were young, and I didn't realise it wasn't just the Flintstones, it actually had a different title, episodes of the Flintstones where Pebbles and Bam Bam are grown up, young adults. The thing that struck me even then was, they should make the parents look a bit older because they look exactly the same. They should give them a bit of grey hair and stuff. And when I was seeing Pebbles and Bam Bam's wedding on YouTube the other day, and the parents are all there looking exactly the same. Mr. Slate and his wife are there. I must give Flintstone his job back after this. It's almost like there's a floating timeline in the show, except with Pebbles and Bam Bam. So as a piece of world building, I think that's somewhat lacking. They should have done more with moving the characters on around the pair of them. But obviously, as a couple, they can carry a show and a series of specials, and we want to see them have their twins, Chip and Roxy, at the end.
Pebbles is always very keen when they're babies, isn't she? What we haven't mentioned is that Bam Bam has super strength. I think he's probably the only character in the Flintstones with any kind of superpower, and Pebbles loves it. He's lifting up great big heavy bits of furniture and stuff, and she is clapping and going, ooh. So clearly she likes a manly man.
And as we were finding out, they make judicious use of Bam Bam's super strength when he's older. Like when Pebbles is having one of her female moments, she does suffer a bit from being a female on the television in the 60s and 70s, when she's getting all into her tears about Bam Bam's trying to propose to her and she doesn't quite understand what's going on. And Bam Bam uses his super strength to stop the sauropod bus that she's going off in a half on. And I discovered that Roxy, the girl of their boy-girl twins, inherits Bam Bam's super strength, as well as his hair.
Now, talking of sauropods, I think in the Flintstones pretty much all the sauropods are called Brontosaurus. Of course, Fred has his Bronto crane, and that's a 60s thing, isn't it? They didn't know very much about dinosaurs then. And I think this is more of a Victorian thing, but I read that the reason the Brontosaurus isn't really a thing is because the discoverers of the bones were racing to be the first to discover a new dinosaur, and they were putting together all these sauropod bones that were from different species and calling that a Brontosaurus. And it took me a long time to get the Bronto ribs gag in the end sequence after they've been to the drive-in movie and put Pebbles and Bam Bam on Dino's head and everything, and they go and get their Bronto ribs. You have to read the sign Bronto ribs and burgers. I didn't really know about ribs. We went to McDonald's as children. We didn't go and get ribs anywhere.
I can specifically remember not understanding what the hell was going on in that end sequence.
I think I remember getting it one day thinking, oh, that's some sort of dinosaur meat. And if you were doing that now, you get it from a chicken or something. So it wouldn't make your car tip over. And I suppose that's quite funny, but it's probably funnier if you're an American and you regularly go to the drive-thru and you get ribs. Another thing I noticed, there are no dangerous dinosaurs, are there? Of course there wouldn't be in the Flintstones, because it's a family show and it's a cartoon and the dinosaurs are all part of the wackiness and the comedy. Dino looks like he might be a theropod, but he's also a dog. He's not a dog, he's a dinosaur, but he has the characteristics of a pet dog. And I suppose it struck me recently watching the films, dinosaurs are a part of their everyday life, and I thought that's a bit different from Jurassic Park and this book I've been reading lately, The Extinction Trials.
The other thing I remember thinking when watching the closing sequence when I was very young was, why doesn't Fred go in the window, like the cat did? And you were saying perhaps the window's supposed to be too small for Fred, and perhaps that is the case, but they haven't drawn it too small. Fred's banging on the door going, Wilma, I think go in the window, like the cat did. But of course the interesting thing about that bit of the sequence is it's the only bit that's carried over from the first two seasons' instrumental Flintstones opening and closing. Fred and the cat having some sort of put out for the night altercation, and that's why in the lyrics it says someday maybe Fred will win the fight and that cat will stay out for the night, because we've seen him do it for 2 and a bit seasons already.
As a child, I agree with you about Fred going through the window, but I can see their thinking jumping in through the window is a cat thing, isn't it? Not really a human thing.
Preparatory to moving on to the live-action films, one of which which has been mentioned a couple of times already. I thought it would just be useful to say a word about Fred's character in the cartoon series. He's very much a typical sitcom dad, and indeed perhaps he's setting the parameters in it for what a typical sitcom dad is like. But he's rather thoughtless and bullish and a bit unreasonably pompous at times. You were talking about how he was being silly about Barney and Betty being close to Pebbles, for example. But underneath it all, he's terribly caring, and you're very much supposed to feel for him and root for him in the end.
He does go over and apologise to Barney and Betty, and that's quite a nice scene.
If you think of Homer Simpson when he's done properly, and certainly in the early Simpsons, that description that I just gave of Fred could very much be applied to him, for example. And bearing that in mind about Fred is a good way to come in to judge the movies. Of course, it's not the be-all and end-all, but Fred being kind of the central character in many ways, it's a good thing to have in mind. Of course, with him being like this, Wilma in the cartoon gets to do a lot of nagging, doesn't she? And we were saying, if you're going to be a live-action Wilma, the thing to work on is how you say Fred, because that's the way you're going to be kind of approaching your interactions with him. I think Barney in the cartoon, played by Mel Blanc, who we discussed at great length on our Warner Brothers podcast, is in some ways your kind of dim-witted sidekick friend character, which has certainly influenced some aspects of the live-action movies. Betty, I think, is a difficult character probably to get to grips with if you're trying to adapt her in any way, because she's kind of there to fill in that extra role in the quartet, isn't she? She's the main character's best friend's wife.
And the main character's wife's best friend.
So she's kind of the one that is the least well-defined. And perhaps if you're coming into a live-action movie as the fourth of the main stars, the one you have to work hardest with. And as you say, the Flintstones cinematic blockbuster movie was released in the summer of 1994, and we did see it in the cinema. And it was one of these things that was everywhere. There were tie-in fridge magnets in Tetley Tea, and they had the adaptation of the theme tune on the Tetley Tea adverts. Have a yabba-dabba-doo time at Tetley Tea time, etc. And they had the recording of the theme song by the B-52s, changed name of course to the BC-52s, which was released as a single, and it really was everywhere and something you were supposed to enjoy as a family and go to as a family activity over the summer.
I think we did both of those things, go to it and enjoy it. I don't think we loved it, nor did we scrutinise it like we did about a week ago and pick holes in it, which we're about to do. I enjoyed it. It was what I wanted, expected from a Flintstones live-action movie.
I knew I liked John Goodman, who played Fred from Roseanne, and I've liked him in other things since.
It was the first time I was ever aware of John Goodman.
And we'd already enjoyed Rick Moranis, who played Barney, in the Ghostbusters movies and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and its sequel.
The film also starred Elizabeth Perkins as Wilma and Rosie O'Donnell as Betty, and I do think they're an appropriate cast. I think that all of them look the part, largely to do with costume and makeup, but they did think about height. John Goodman's very tall. Rick Moranis isn't as short as he seems. He always seems to work with tall people. And of course Barney is significantly shorter than Fred, and then the two women are about the same height. And I found that satisfying, along with the work by Jim Henson's Creature Workshop. The previous year we'd had Jurassic Park, and I was like, are you sure these aren't real dinosaurs? That's incredible. And you don't get that with Jim Henson's Creature Workshop, but you don't want that with the Flintstones. It's a very cartoony style that they do, and it's a fun, colourful, cartoony show, and the Jim Henson dinosaurs and prehistoric mammals and things are very appropriate, and they fit very well in with the tone, and they contribute to the tone that this film was trying to create. And so in terms of the cast and what it looks like and how they create the cartoon world in a live action version, it is quite satisfying. I do think they go too far in trying to evoke the cartoon world when they do a thing which is physically impossible, which is have Fred float on air. And it's towards the end when he's shouting yabba dabba doo. And I think, oh no, I don't like that. I think that when you're doing live action, everything that you see should be physically possible. Otherwise, it takes you out of that verisimilitude, doesn't it, of the world that you're looking at. And they also recreate a version of the title sequence with sliding down the tail of the Bronto crane and all that. Sliding down the tail and into his car, maybe that's going a step too far as well. But I didn't really notice until that floating on air thing and then coming down to earth by flapping its feet. I thought, oh no.
Perhaps keeping it within the opening title sequence recreation is okay. That'd be a step away from the narrative of the movie.
So that's what's going on with the world building. Now, the plot and the characterization, as we said when we watched it about a week ago, it's all just a bit off. At various points we're watching going, oh no, they shouldn't have done it quite like that. For instance, the main thing is that Fred gets promoted to an office job at the quarry by Kyle MacLachlan in order that Kyle MacLachlan, can get him to sign things and set him up for embezzling money and laying off all the quarry workers and all sorts of evil things. It's how they go about it. That plot itself is fine, but then if that's what he and Halle Berry as Miss Sharon Stone, very amusing, want to do, why do they give them an actual real aptitude test and give the job to the person with the highest score, or who they believe has the highest score? That doesn't make any sense. And as you were pointing out, when Cliff is saying to Miss Stone, how did Fred Flintstone get the highest score? He's a complete idiot, basically. And she's going, he's perfect. It's like, well, why don't you give him the job for being a bit thick then? If you think that that's what you need, why give them this aptitude test?
When Barney was swapping the papers, his and Fred's papers, it really came to me. I thought, yeah, they're going to give Fred the job because they think he's got the highest score, but they want him for a stool pigeon, so they should give it to him because he gets the lowest score. And when Miss Stone's saying he's perfect, I was like, well, why didn't you realise that before? For your plan, you need the stupidest one, the one who's not going to ask questions, the one you can manipulate. It's lucky for your plan that Barney has, out of the mistaken goodness of his heart, to pay Fred back for giving him money so he can be accepted for adopted Bam Bam, swap the papers.
And that leads to, I think, too much conflict. As we were saying as well, it's by the numbers. It's got a very certain structure. And one of the points on the writing frame is all your friends hate you for the main character, Fred. Of course, Barney's going to be carrying a lot of baggage, knowing that he swapped tests with Fred. By the way, they haven't gone with the infantilizing, dumb sidekick Barney character for this. But, yes, due to Barney's actions, Fred has got the new job, and Barney has got the worst score and got fired, so that leads to trouble, and it's just too much. The Flintstones and the Rubbles becoming deadly enemies, carrying all this bitterness. It's sort of uncomfortable to watch, and it's unnecessary. It would make more sense, and it would be better for the characters if they did this aptitude test and gave it to Fred because he got the lowest score. So that's one issue. And then Kyle MacLachlan tells Fred he has to be the one to fire Barney. And I'm like, why does he have to do it? If Kyle MacLachlan fired Barney himself, Barney would still have no job. You'd still have that issue to overcome in the film. He could still be jealous of Fred's perceived success.
And it's not like Cliff isn't planning to lay off all the workers anyway. Why do Barney a couple of weeks before the others? Ostensibly because of the aptitude score. Simply for the structure to screw over Fred as a character in the movie.
And there's a stage in the movie where the Rubbles are homeless. It's not really clear quite what's gone on there. They've rented out their house and moved in with the Flintstones, but then when they leave, because they hate them so much, can they not go back to their own house? Have they been repossessed? What's gone on there?
I said to them, do you still own your house? Are people still living in it and you're living out in this swamp? You should kick them out and have your house back.
then Wilma turns round and says, look what money and success has done to us, Fred. I'm not doing it anymore. I don't need these pearls. And we're like, you've had those all along, Wilma. Those aren't from the job money. I don't need this television. And you think it shouldn't spark when she breaks the television. And she's like just destroying everything in the house and taking pebbles and going to her mother, played by Elizabeth Taylor. So at that point in the film, all Fred's friends hate him, including his wife. But then he does come through in the end. And compared to Viva Rock Vegas, which we'll go into more detail about shortly, he hasn't done too much wrong on the way, really. And he's shown Miss Stone that he's a decent guy and loves his wife and is concerned for the welfare of quarry workers, and you think, she's going to be like Foxglove in the Rescue Rangers or something, and realise that Carl McLachlan is bad and she doesn't want to be evil, and Fred doesn't deserve to get screwed over. And this is another issue. She is feeling these things, but she doesn't bother doing anything about it and helping Fred until she finds out that Carl McLachlan is screwing her over as well. And she should do it because it's the right thing to do, not because she realises she's not going to get any of the money after all.
The problem I always had with it from the very first viewing in the cinema is it's one of those things where you get to the denouement and the exciting action-packed conclusion is happening, and you think, didn't one of the characters earlier have some sort of superpower that could have got him and others out of this situation? And in this case, it's Bam Bam and his super strength. I think you were telling me the other day that you'd originally been slightly disappointed that Pebbles and Bam Bam were older, like 5-year-old children in this movie rather than babies. And then you'd realise, well, yeah, of course they have to be a little older for practical reasons.
Yes, that's exactly what I said. They're both played by a set of twins. I remember that Pebbles' twins are called Elaine and Melanie something, and Bam Bam's twins have got Scandinavian names and a very Scandinavian surname, and his voice is dubbed over by E.G. Daly, and once you know that you think, oh yeah, he does sound like Tommy Pickles. And of course it's easier for the filmmakers to get hold of these 5-year-old sets of twins rather than babies, and then it's easier for them to get them to do anything and be part of the plot. And I went through that whole thought process seeing the trailer in the space of about a second. I thought, they're not babies. Oh, well, I suppose. And actually, I do find their interaction in the film quite satisfying. You never really can go wrong with Pebbles and Bam Bam, it seems. They're very much in the background, but you can see that she's enjoying his super strength. She's clapping when he's lifting up this stone bench thing. Wilma and Betty are having a talk about their lives, and in the background, Bam Bam's pushing Pebbles on the swing, and she's going, wee! And when Betty and Bam Bam come to mend the rift and see Wilma and Pebbles at Pearl Slag Hoople's house, the two children are very glad to see each other, and the grown-up actors are all acting this scene, and you think, well, the happiest person in all this lot is Pebbles, getting hugged and lifted up by Bam Bam. In a way, it's a shame that they weren't in the other movie, but of course they couldn't be, because that's about their parents meeting and falling in love.
Of course, as Bam Bam's adoption takes place, and the fact that Fred has given the Rubbles money in order to be eligible for it, made me realise from first watching it, well, this is obviously AU from the cartoon, and that's always the case, really, with cartoon versions and movie versions, whichever one comes first. But Viva Rock Vegas really is supposed to be, I think, the same universe as and a direct prequel to the Flintstones 1994. When we watched them the time before this time, when Rosie first got her DVD, we watched Viva Rock Vegas first. And then Fred, John Goodman, is saying when he met Wilma, she was a waitress, and we're like, oh yeah, she is in Viva Rock Vegas. They've really tried to match it up, make it the same universe. And then Fred kind of tells this story about when Wilma was a waitress and he was a customer that doesn't happen in Viva Rock Vegas. So you think, okay, it's not quite the same. But really, Viva Rock Vegas is meant to be a direct prequel, and there is even one actor credited as the same character who who in his younger days apparently did the dunking booth at the fair, and then later is part of Fred and Barney's bowling team, and his name is Joe Rockhead, and you wouldn't get that those were the same character just watching the movie casually. But whatever shortcomings I thought the Flintstones had after watching it just over a week ago, I thought, well, it's an absolute masterpiece in comparison to Viva Rock Vegas, and perhaps it is better to watch Viva Rock Vegas first, because then the original, next one in chronological order, will seem much better, I think.
Well, when we first watched Viva Rock Vegas on the television, we turned it off afterwards, and you said, well, that was... And you didn't want to say good, but I don't think you wanted to say bad. And I said entertaining. And it was, and I think it was more entertaining the first time, and possibly even the second time before we really started scrutinising it. And in many ways, the first half I do find quite satisfying, in spite of the cast not being as appropriate. I don't want to say as good. They're talented, funny actors. Mark Addy and Kristen Johnston in particular we've both enjoyed in their respective sitcoms, but they are less appropriate, and just purely on the surface they haven't thought about the height like they did with John Goodman and Friends. They get Fred and Barney, Stephen Baldwin, to do impressions of the original voices. Now, I'm not sure what to say about Stephen Baldwin. I think it's a reasonable Barney impression. I think it would have been better if he hadn't done it. I think the whole characterisation of Barney is a bit off. He's too stupid. But then, it doesn't matter so much as with Fred. Not to me, anyway. I think that Mark Addy's Fred impression isn't even a very good Fred impression. And it would have been much better if he had just done it his own way. I'll mention Betty now. Jane Krakowski, I did remember her name, as Betty, as she says, oh, Shale. We found out that she had some different, silly, unpronounceable maiden name in the cartoon, so I guess I can see why they changed that. And again, as you were saying earlier, it's difficult to sort of get a handle on her. She does a sort of silly cartoon 60s woman voice. She says the lines in the way that anyone would. She conveys what Betty must be feeling at any one time. I mean, there's nothing wrong with her, but it's a challenging role, I think, to kind of make anything of. And then you've got Kristen Johnston as Wilma, and I do remember seeing the trailer and thinking, Kristen Johnston as Wilma? And I thought, well, maybe I'm being unfair to her, maybe she's like really versatile, but whilst I don't quite like to say she's not versatile, maybe she is, but she does act Wilma Slag Hoople in very much the same way that she acts Sally Solomon in Third Rock from the Sun.
That's really what she's good at, and it is funny, and even when she was on ER for a bit as an unpopular new chief of nursing, I think she did weave in some of that Sally Solomon comedy, and it does work very well, and why not?
It's fish out of water comedy, isn't it? Sally Solomon, the alien, trying to get used to life as a human. Wilma having run away from her rich, sheltered home to Bedrock, going bowling and stuff. That dunking guy you were talking about gets hit on the head and falls in the water by Wilma rather than her hitting the target, and then it cuts to this shot of her celebrating, just like Sally would do.
Of course, Kristen Johnston does do what's undoubtedly my favourite bit, and it's not really a comedy bit at all, which is Wilma standing up to her mother. She has this big realisation, seeing how her posh society friends, particularly her mother, have been treating her new friends, particularly Fred, and Wilma realises, hey, this is horrible. You're not treating them like people. You're all rich and snobby and you talk down to them like that, and it's awful. And she stands up to her mother by saying, these people aren't like you, and that's why I like them. And I thought that was quite powerful and an important moment of realisation, and one that a lot of people have in some ways. The scales falling from their eyes about their parents. I think Kristen Johnston did that well.
Pearl Slag Hoople, her mother, played by Joan Collins this time. In both cases, they got a very famous veteran actress. Same sort of thing, aren't they? Joan Collins, Elizabeth Taylor. Up to that point, I think the film is entertaining. There's nothing really wrong with the plot. And it's at that same gathering where this person called Chip, who wants to marry Wilma for her money, is looking down on Fred and laughing at him for being a Bronto crane operator. And Fred is sticking up for himself and not saying, but implying, I'm proud to work at the quarry as a Bronto crane operator and be myself. And that sequence ends with the awesome foursome turning around and walking out, and I'm like, they should just stop the film there.
I thought it would have been rather nice to stop when Chip Rockefeller had come out and said, "Hey, you were right, I was wrong, I'm very sorry, Fred." And they shake hands and he says, "Come and spend a nice weekend at my casino and I'll take care of you." Fred's like, "Hey, you're okay, Chip," and they're shaking hands, and that seems to be very nice. Of course Chip has an evil plan to screw Fred over and get himself out of debt, but if you stopped the film at that point and had a montage of them all enjoying themselves at Rock Vegas as the closing credits, I would like that film quite a lot.
Now, at the risk of victim blaming, it's hard to feel sorry for Fred because he walks right into it and it doesn't make any sense after what's just happened at Pearl's party that she was having for Wilma's father, isn't it? His birthday.
She does emotional blackmail on Wilma to get her to come back for her father's birthday. Oh, I don't know how many more he'll have. It all leads up rather nicely to Wilma standing up to her mother.
Now, who we haven't mentioned yet, which is going to be relevant to the 180-degree turn that Fred takes, is Alan Cumming as the Great Gazoo. And when I first heard that this character was going to be in the film, I was like, who? What? Alien? Little green alien in a little spaceship? What? And then I thought, oh, that does sound familiar.
The movie starts with the Great Gazoo and his species on their spaceship, and we're like, oh, we thought this was supposed to be a Flintstones movie. But then I think we've both got some recollection of seeing him in the cartoon, and only Fred and Barney knew he was there, and Pebbles could also see him. But we'd really forgotten about it until that stage, and if you look it up, you find out, yes, he is a very late introduced character, and possibly a bit of a jump the shark, rather bad idea, and inglorious remembered part of the Flintstones original series.
Does this film need him for the plot? I don't think so. What he's there for in the story is to observe, as they put it, mating rituals. More than actual mating, he's interested in falling in love and getting married, isn't he? And the reason I brought him up now was that he kind of planted the seed of doubt in Fred's mind by looking at his engagement ring that he got to give Wilma and going, ew, what a crappy little ring, Wilma's not going to like that. And Fred's like, of course she will, it's not the material aspect that matters, it's that I'm in love with her. And you're like, yeah, right on, Fred. But then they go to Rock Vegas, and it's all downhill from there. It's called the Flintstones and Viva Rock Vegas. There's only one Flintstone at this point, isn't there, Fred? Having learnt that Wilma comes from a rich, privileged background, even though they've all walked out together in solidarity and he's stuck up for himself, he's like, oh, now I'm at the casino, I can win loads of money and buy Wilma loads of expensive things and a great big massive engagement ring. And we're all like, no, come on, you've got past this already. You've barely even got to that stage in the first place. So then he's winning all this money, which is part of Chip Rockefeller setting him up. Wilma's like, let's get out of here, Fred. Let's not do any more gambling. Let's go and do something fun. Let's go bowling. Bowling was something that they'd done when they were forming their bond. And Fred says to her, whilst counting all his chips, bowling's for poor people. And we're like, why would you say that? You know that Wilma enjoyed bowling with you and getting away from her stupid rich family, and it just doesn't make sense. And besides that, you've got Barney saying maybe you should quit while you're ahead, Fred. You've got the Great Gazoo saying, don't you smell a rat here? This is Chip Rockefeller's casino, and Chip Rockefeller wants to marry your girl, and you're winning all this stuff. Don't you think this stinks of some kind of setup? And Fred's just not listening to anyone. And it's annoying because it doesn't make sense. He's just walking into this trap, and it's completely inconsistent with everything that's already happened. And even if it wasn't completely inconsistent, it would be really bad for the character anyway. But then later, and this is my gripe with the Great Gazoo, Fred's got himself framed. I say that because I do think he walks right into it. He walks right up to Chip with his challenge of, oh, I'm going to tell Wilma that he was screwing me over, and Chip's like, fine, I'm going to frame you for stealing her pearls. And so that's why I say he walked into it. He should have just gone and told Wilma. But anyway, after this, Fred and Barney end up in prison, and the Great Gazoo turns up saying, oh, what did you get in this situation for, you stupid idiot? Wilma doesn't want you gambling in the casino and trying to win loads of money. And I'm like, you were the one who slagged off this ring earlier. So the whole thing just doesn't make sense, and there's also the fact that Betty has seen Barney wiping the decoration of this cake off another woman's breasts who's been distracting him. Her name's Roxy. She's Chip's helper. So then she hates Barney and Wilma hates Fred, and it's not at all organic how this all comes about.
I was reading earlier that Alan Cumming was nominated for a Golden Raspberry for Worst Supporting Comedy Performance for his dual role as the Great Gazoo and Mick Jagged. And he didn't win it. And I thought, oh, well, he probably would have deserved to win it if he did. But then it's not really fair, I think, to pick him out of what's wrong with the movie. He's just a part of it.
Yeah, he does all you can with the roles. And I think overall, as well as all that, we find Viva Rock Vegas too cartoony, don't we? Because of the inclusion of the Great Gazoo, because of the Fred and Barney and Betty impressions, and also there's a bit of floating, and it's even more floating than John Goodman does. Just when you think maybe Fred's about to realise what he's doing and get out of that casino, he gets tempted by this slot machine and goes floating over to that, and that whole sequence, it's just the nail in the coffin, really. It's bad characterisation and it's bad staging.
Quite near the beginning, when Fred and Barney first see Betty and Wilma, you have the love hearts appearing in mid-air around them, and the Great Gazoo appears and starts popping them and saying, come on, let's get on with it. And I think I thought at that stage, ooh, they've gone a bit too far the cartoon way, even when I first watched it.
So really, they've finished on a low, haven't they, which is a shame. And I think that film was salvageable, as I said, right up until they actually went to Rock Vegas.
So there, another very interesting podcast comes to an end. But hopefully you'll join us again next time for another one, which will be the final Sunday in August, when we'll be talking about Superman. Mainly the 1970s and 80s Christopher Reeve movies and the 1990s TV series Lois and Clark: The New Adventures of Superman. But there'll be other parts of the franchise to cross-reference and talk about as well, I'm sure. Until then,
good night out there.
Whatever you are.